Chapter 1. The Village Fair. There was an air of innocent festivity about the St. Giles annual autumn fair. It had rained the previous night, but by morning the skies had turned a serene porcelain blue, and the hedgerows glistened with reluctant dew. Larkspur Lane, lined with stalls decorated in bunting and marigold garlands, was already bustling before the church clock struck 11. Baskets of apples and jars of blackberry jam stood proudly beside hand-knitted scarves and second-hand books. Children, sticky with toffee and mischief, darted between booths, and a brass band wheezed a familiar tune near the green. At the centre of the fair stood the prized attraction, the Guess the Rhyme tent, a modest canvas pavilion, painted cheerfully with faded illustrations of nursery scenes. Inside, visitors were invited to decipher cryptic clues connected to beloved childhood rhymes. It was a simple diversion, clever, wholesome, and unassuming. "Such a quaint idea," said Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wooden bench just outside the tea stall. I do admire these small efforts to engage the mind, though I dare say some of those rhymes are rather darker than we remember." She sipped delicately from her cup of Earl Grey. Her blue-gloved hands were steady, her hat neatly pinned, and her eyes, though framed by the softness of age, missed nothing. From her vantage point, she observed the passing crowd with quiet attention. There was Mr. Giles Carter, the local solicitor, fussing over his lapel. There was Miss Evangeline Pratt, schoolmistress turned rhyme master, flitting between visitors and fussing with the clue cards. And there, beside the cake stall, stood Lydia, Martingale, widowed 3 years, well-groomed, and always just on the edge of scandal. Her skirts were a shade too rich for mourning, and her eyes were too quick to dismiss what they saw. "Will you have a second slice, Miss Marple?" asked young Polly Ransom, the vicar's niece, offering a plate of sponge cake. "No, dear, I find 2 slices at my age makes one dangerously sluggish in deduction." Polly laughed, unsure whether Miss Marple was joking. As usual, all seemed well, and the fair passed its first hour in cheerful fashion. That is, until a scream cut across the music. It came from the Guess the Rhyme tent. The music stopped with an awkward wheeze. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. People turned, some already moving towards the source of the sound. Marple did not run. She stood, set down her cup, and moved swiftly but without panic toward the tent. Inside, she found a small crowd gathered around the central display, a freestanding panel of painted rhyme illustrations, Jack and Jill tumbling. Down the hill, the cat with the fiddle, and little Miss Muffet seated demurely beside her curds and whey. It was beneath the depiction of Humpty Dumpty that the body lay. Draped across the display's base, slumped at an unnatural angle, was Miss Evangeline Pratt. Her cardigan had ridden up her back, revealing a long white scratch across her shoulder blades. Her spectacles hung askew, and her eyes, usually bright with irritation, were wide, glassy, and unmistakably lifeless. A shriek echoed again, this time from Mrs. Lumley, the baker's wife. "She's dead! Oh, mercy, she's dead!" Someone rushed for the vicar. Someone else shouted for Dr. Connolly. The crowd buzzed and broke and circled again like panicked bees. Miss Marple said nothing. She moved closer, careful not to step too near the body. Instead, her eyes skimmed the surroundings. the overturned chair, the broken teacup on the grass just outside the tent flap, the torn corner of a clue card fluttering beneath the table. She knelt slowly and picked up the card. The rhyme printed. On it read, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. The rest had been scribbled out. She slipped the card discreetly into her handbag. When the constable arrived, young, red-faced and visibly overwhelmed, he began asking confused questions and taking down names in a notebook with trembling hands. The villagers, as ever, were eager to offer answers even when they had none. Poison, I'd say. Always said she kept odd tinctures about. Perhaps a heart attack. She was high-strung, you know. Or slipped. She's always rushing about like a sparrow on gin. Could have been Lydia, someone whispered. They'd quarrelled last week over that rhyme contest. She said Evangeline cheated. Miss Marple quietly stepped back, letting the chatter bloom and curdle. But her thoughts were already elsewhere. There had been no signs of struggle, no visible wound, no shout before the scream. And yet the body's posture, the broken cup, the torn clue, all suggested something far from accidental. Miss Evangeline Pratt had not simply collapsed. And if the rhyme card was anything to go by, someone had planned this carefully, hiding their malice behind childhood innocence. Later that evening, as the village fell into anxious murmuring and the fair dismantled itself in stunned silence, Miss Marple sat by her window with a pot of EA and her notebook open on her lap. She wrote 3 simple lines. Body found beneath Humpty Dumpty illustration. 2. Rhyme card, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. Torn 3. No sign of violence, but presence of symbolism suggests message. Paused, then underlined the final thought. This was no random death. It was a performance. And somewhere in the village, beneath the familiar faces and the careful smiles, someone had played their part to perfection. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the next morning, the village of St. Giles had transformed. The bunting was gone, the fair tents folded and packed away, but something more permanent had shifted in the air. The cheerfulness that usually returned. After any community upset, the comforting routine of gossip, tea, and distraction refused to emerge. Instead, there was a muted tension that lingered like a mist over the hedgerows and High Street. People spoke in lowered voices, glancing over shoulders as they did so. Polite smiles grew thinner. The simple phrase, "Did you hear?" passed through every shop and lane, always followed by a pause long enough to carry suspicion on its own. In the village shop, Mrs. Lumley wrapped scones in wax paper with unusually tight fingers. Across the counter, Lydia Martingale selected pears with theatrical calm, though her usual bright silk scarf had been replaced with a tasteful navy one. "It's such a dreadful thing," said Mrs. Lumley, her voice deliberately light. "Poor Miss Pratt, I can hardly believe it. She was never well liked," Lydia replied coolly, "but I wouldn't have wished her dead." Mrs. Lumley looked up sharply. "Well, I wouldn't have either, naturally." "But someone did," Lydia said, placing her fruit on the scale. "That's the real problem, isn't it?" Outside the shop, 2 schoolchildren whispered by the green, pointing at the now empty rhyme tent, which still bore a faint outline in the grass. "They say her face was all white," one said, "like chalk." The other shivered and kicked at a stone. At the church, Reverend Prowse spoke gently about community and forgiveness, offering platitudes that rang oddly hollow in the echo of Miss Pratt's sudden death. Few had truly liked the woman. She had a way of correcting even the vicar's pronunciation. But the fact remained, she had been a fixture, and now she was gone. In the parlour of the vicarage, Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward like a question still waiting to be asked. She had visited the scene again that morning under the pretence of retrieving her forgotten shawl. Constable Evans had not objected. He was, after all, still flustered and rather grateful for Miss Marple's calming presence. She had taken a closer look at the clue cards, now slightly damp from overnight dew. Most were cheerful, whimsical things, riddles leading to Mary, Mary quite contrary, or Bar Bar Black Sheep. But the one near Miss Pratt's body had been different, darker, and missing its conclusion. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, the old magpie rhyme. But what had the rest said? It was Lydia Martingale who first brought the rhyme back up, quite casually, during a garden club meeting at Mrs. Weatherby's. "Strange, isn't it?" she said, trimming a bruised petal from a rose. That particular rhyme, the one left half-finished. Mrs. Weatherby looked confused. "Magpies, you mean?" "Yes. People always forget how it goes." But Miss Pratt knew it, start to finish. She once recited it at the Literary Society meeting, quite theatrically. "What does it mean, though?" asked Polly Ransom, perched nervously beside a tray of begonias. "I only ever knew the first 2 lines. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy," Lydia said smoothly. 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, and 7 for a secret never to be told." There was a pause. Miss Marple, trimming the edge of a paper packet of seeds, did not look up. But she took note of the way Polly glanced down at her hands, or the way Mrs. Weatherby suddenly found her tea too hot to sip. Later that evening, Miss Marple made her way to the home of Giles Carter, the local solicitor. She had seen him at the fair, fussing with a ribbon on the guessing tent. He had known Miss Pratt well, or at least claimed to have suffered her company for years. Carter greeted her with cautious civility. He was a thin man, the sort who always appeared slightly irritated by furniture arrangements. "I can't imagine what's brought you," he said, ushering her into a study that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and polished leather. "I thought I might share a few thoughts about Evangeline," Miss Marple said, settling herself into a stiff-backed chair. "I understand she helped with the fair's rhyme tent." Carter scoffed. "More than helped. She insisted on it. She was determined to make it intellectually stimulating, which of course meant obscure, convoluted, and utterly joyless. Selected the rhyme cards herself. Oh yes, wouldn't allow anyone else near them. Curious," said Miss Marple, "particularly as one of them seems to have gone missing." Carter blinked. "Missing? The magpie rhyme," she said. "It was found half-torn. Perhaps someone didn't appreciate the implication." He looked uncomfortable. "She could be pointed sometimes. If she meant something by it, I wouldn't be surprised." Ridio. She often used riddles to make her feelings known. She preferred insinuation to confrontation, he said, and she knew more about people than she let on. Used it when it suited her. Miss Marple nodded. Then perhaps someone decided they'd had enough of her riddles. Outside, dusk was settling in, painting the sky with muted strokes of lavender and grey. As she walked home, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of contemplation. A rhyme about secrets. A woman disliked but tolerated until now. A torn clue. And too many people who pretended to know nothing while knowing too much. In her drawing room, with the fire crackling softly and her cat asleep by the hearth, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added 3 new lines. Evie used rhymes to make veiled accusations. The magpie rhyme, 7 for a secret never to be told, deliberately placed. Who in St. Giles feared a secret becoming known? She underlined the last line twice. Someone in the village had killed Evangeline Pratt, not out of passion, not in a fit of rage, but with calculation, with meaning, with a rhyme. And Miss Marple, eyes calm behind her spectacles, would find them, one clue at a time. Chapter through. Early investigation. Miss Marple never rushed when it came to uncovering the truth. She had learned long ago that people revealed far more in silence than they ever did under questioning. So while the village clucked and speculated over Miss Pratt's demise, Miss Marple quietly began her work, not with interrogations or dramatic theories, but with visits, chats, and observations delivered under the warm veil of social courtesy. Her first stop was the vicarage. Officially, she had come to return a borrowed gardening book. In reality, she wished to speak with young Polly Ransom again. The girl had looked unusually pale during the garden club meeting, and while that might have been attributed to the sudden, cold snap, Miss Marple had noticed how her hands had trembled when Lydia recited the full rhyme. Polly greeted her with a shy smile, ushering her into the cosy parlour where the scent of baked apples lingered. "Do sit down, Miss Marple. Aunt is out visiting Mrs. Lumley, but I've just made tea." Miss Marple lowered herself into a floral armchair and accepted a steaming cup. She offered the girl a warm smile, then stirred her own tea with deliberate calm. "I imagine the vicarage has been quite busy since the fair," she said mildly. Polly nodded. "There's been so much talk. I didn't think people could talk more than they already did, but they have. And you, my dear? How have you been feeling about it all?" Polly hesitated. "It's strange. I didn't like Miss Pratt very much. No one really did. But she didn't deserve to die like that." "No, indeed," said Miss Marple gently. "But I wonder. You seemed rather startled at the mention of the magpie rhyme the other day. Did it remind you of something?" Polly blinked. Oh, only that she was always quoting it. Not just at the fair. Sometimes she'd say it in the schoolroom when we were little, especially when someone had done something wrong. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yes. She had a way of making it sound very serious, like it meant more than it did. I remember once, after Lydia Martingale's niece broke a vase at the flower show and lied about it, Miss Pratt said, 7 for a secret, and then just walked off. She used rhymes as warnings then." Polly nodded slowly. "It was like she knew things she wasn't supposed to, or things you hoped no one else would notice." Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence. There was no need to press Polly further. The girl had confirmed what she already suspected. Evangeline Pratt had been watching the village just as carefully as Miss Marple did, but with less grace. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the Martingale residence. The Martingales had lived at Elm House for 3 generations, and Lydia, now widowed, occupied it alone, save for a housemaid and her visiting niece Daphne, who had returned recently from Cheltenham under unclear circumstances. Miss Marple found Daphne in the garden, gathering windfall apples with a gloved hand and a faraway expression. She greeted her warmly. "Such a lovely day to be among the trees, isn't it?" Daphne looked up, startled, then smiled politely. "Yes, though these apples are no good for anything but cider now. Aunt Lydia says it's a shame to waste even those." Miss Marple chuckled. "Your aunt has always had an eye for thrift." She knelt to help retrieve a stubborn apple from beneath the hedge. "I've been meaning to ask after you, my dear. Cheltenham must have been lively." Daphne's smile dimmed. It was all right. I always think young people find the country dull after such cities. Or perhaps the opposite is true. Too much noise, too little kindness. Daphne hesitated. "I didn't really want to come back, but things changed." Miss Marple didn't ask what. She simply reached for another apple and said, "I imagine it's difficult being back under Aunt Lydia's roof. She has strong ideas, I hear." Daphne gave a small laugh. "You could say that." And what did she think of Miss Pratt's tent? Daphne's face shifted again, ever so slightly. She didn't like it. She said it was childish, but I know they argued the week before the fair. "Over rhymes?" "Over something," Daphne said, brushing a leaf from her coat. "Aunt Lydia said Miss Pratt was prying into things that weren't her concern. Something about an old disagreement, I think." Miss Marple didn't reply. She stood slowly, brushing soil from her skirt. That evening, she sat by the hearth with her notebook, the cat curled at her feet, the fire popping with small bursts of pine sap. She turned to a fresh page. Miss Pratt used rhyme cards as veiled accusations, magpie rhyme possibly directed at someone specific, someone hiding a secret. Polly recalls Miss Pratt using rhymes as subtle discipline, never openly accusatory, always suggestive. Daphne Martingale confirms a recent quarrel between Lydia and Miss Pratt. She tapped her pen against the margin, then added, "What secret did Lydia fear might be uncovered?" The next day brought another unexpected. Red. Constable Evans, red-cheeked and breathless, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just before lunch. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, removing his cap nervously. "We found something odd in Miss Pratt's belongings." "Go on," said Miss Marple, calmly folding her napkin. An envelope tucked inside a copy of Mother Goose Rhymes. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just marked, "For the Fair." Inside were handwritten notes, little summaries beside each rhyme. All of them were linked to people in the village, like the rhymes were coded messages. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "May I see them?" He nodded, handing her the envelope. She drew out the notes carefully. Little Jack Horner. Someone hiding something. Old King Cole, the vicar, pompous but harmless. Mary, Mrs. Lumley, jealous of her neighbour's garden. One for sorrow. L.M. knows the truth about the niece. Miss Marple stared at the last line. L.M. Lydia Martingale. She returned the notes without a word. "Anything useful there?" Evans asked. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Only what we already knew, Constable. that Miss Pratt liked her games, but in her notebook later she wrote in firm, clean strokes, M. Lydia Martingale knows the truth about the niece. What truth? Miss Pratt planned to expose a secret through rhyme, and someone silenced her before she could. She closed the book and looked out at the village, quiet beneath the amber leaves. There were truths hiding here. She could feel them in the rhythm of the footfalls, in the shift of the curtains, in the tightening of smiles, and like the old rhymes, they only made sense when you knew what to listen for. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Friday morning, the consensus forming around the tea tables and church pews of St. Giles was that someone must be held accountable, and quickly. The shock of Miss Pratt's death had passed into something more fervent, the need for resolution. The villagers had been rattled, and now they longed for the comfort of a tidy explanation, even if the truth itself remained only half glimpsed. Constable Evans, perhaps encouraged by the flurry of whispered suggestions and a mounting desire to show initiative, acted with unusual confidence. At 10:30, he visited Elm House to speak with Lydia Martingale. The constable's arrival did not go unnoticed. 3 neighbours paused their garden work to fetch tools that needed no fetching. A delivery boy slowed his bicycle as he passed the gate. By midday, the whole village knew that the Martingale parlour had hosted an officer of the law, and that Lydia's expression afterward had been, in Mrs. Lumley's words, not at all becoming of an innocent woman. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Saturday morning dawned with a chill in the air, and the kind of pale grey sky that offered no promise of sun. In St. Giles, the market square was quieter than usual, and even the church bells seemed to ring more hesitantly. The village, still steeped in speculation, had begun to grow weary of its own theories. Miss Marple, however, felt no such fatigue. With a briskness that belied her years, she donned her soft tweed coat, collected her knitting bag, and set out, not to the shops or to a friend's parlour, but to the rhyme tent. Or rather, to where the rhyme tent had stood. The grass was flattened now, but the imprint of the tent's frame remained faintly visible. A few scraps of discarded clue cards fluttered against the low wooden fence nearby. Miss Marple walked the perimeter slowly, noting the tent's orientation, the way it had opened toward the path, the proximity to the refreshment stall, and most interestingly, the distance to the green where Miss Pratt's body had been found. She paused near a tuft of grass where the corner of a paper was caught under a stone. She bent carefully and extracted it. It was another rhyme card, slightly damp, its ink smudged. This one read, "Goosey, goosey gander, whither shall I wander?" She read the next line and stopped. Upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. Miss Marple frowned. That particular rhyme, long dismissed as childish nonsense, had always struck her as oddly suggestive. The final line was rarely recited aloud, but Miss Pratt, one could imagine, would have chosen it with deliberate intent. She slipped the card into her bag and continued walking. As she rounded the hedgerow, she noticed something else, faint but unusual. A piece of thread, white and fine, caught against a splinter in the wooden fence. It was nearly invisible against the pale backdrop, but Miss Marple's eye was trained for such details. She removed it gently, holding it to the light. It was embroidery thread, the sort used for handkerchiefs or fine needlework. She tucked it away. On her way back toward the village, she paused by the vicarage gate. Polly Ransom, arms full of hymn books, spotted her and smiled. "Miss Marple, you've been out early." "I find the air helps the thoughts collect properly," she replied. Polly hesitated, then lowered her voice. "They've all decided it. Was Lydia Martingale, you know." "Oh? She's been at odds with Miss Pratt for years. Daphne's scandal, the argument at the fair. People say it's clear as day." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Clarity, dear, is often mistaken for simplicity, and the truth is rarely simple." Polly flushed. "I didn't mean—" "No need to apologize. But do remember, guilt doesn't always look like what we expect." She smiled and continued on, leaving Polly with a thoughtful expression and a stack of hymnals pressed to her chest. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid the rhyme card on the table beside the thread. She stared at both for a long moment, then opened her notebook. Clue card: Goosey Goosey Gander. Reference to intrusion into a private space, ladies' chamber. Embroidery thread found caught near tent. White, fine quality, likely from a sleeve or handkerchief. Not Miss Pratt's. She recalled seeing Lydia Martingale in dark gloves and a heavy coat that day. Not the sort of garment to shed thread. Daphne, however, had been wearing a pale wool coat with delicate cuffs and lace detailing, far more likely. She turned to another page and wrote, "Was the rhyme directed at Daphne? A veiled accusation of secret indiscretion?" She thought again of the torn card at the scene of the death. The magpie rhyme. 7-4A. Secret never to be told. 2 messages, 2 warnings. Had Miss Pratt discovered more than one secret? Or had she changed targets? She closed her notebook as the knock came. It was Reverend Prowse, looking flustered, his hair wind-swept and his coat only half-buttoned. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, stepping into the hallway. "But something's come up. Rather delicate." Miss Marple led him into the parlour and poured him tea, waiting with quiet patience as he fumbled with his thoughts. "It's about Daphne Martingale," he said at last. "She came to the church this morning, asked to speak with me. She was distressed." "In what way?" "She said she wanted to confess something, but not in a religious sense, more a moral one. She was afraid. I don't think she killed Miss Pratt, but she's hiding something, and it's weighing on her." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Did she say what it was?" The vicar shook his head. "Only that she was sorry. That she didn't stop something when she could have. That she didn't speak when it might have made a difference." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes the heaviest guilt is in what we fail to do. After the vicar left, she returned to her notebook and added Daphne, likely aware of the killer's identity or motive, possibly manipulated or silenced. Her guilt is rooted in omission, not action. The picture was coming into focus now, but not in a way that made the solution obvious. It was layered, as human behaviour often was, with pride, shame, fear, and secrets, each thread tangled into the other. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the village below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows along the cottages and across the green. And there, in the lengthening dark, lay the final path. Miss Marple would follow it, not because the police had lost their way, but because someone in St. Giles had made a game of cruelty. And games, as she well knew, always left traces behind. Inside the cottage, Lydia had received Constable Evans with her usual clipped courtesy, offering no tea and only the briefest of seats. Her manner was cool, collected, almost too composed. "I understand you and Miss Pratt had a recent disagreement," the constable had begun, fumbling with his notebook. "We disagreed about many things," Lydia replied evenly. Evangeline had a talent for making herself disagreeable. "But I didn't kill her, if that's what you're hinting at." Evans reddened. "No one's accusing anyone just yet, ma'am. Only gathering facts." "Then I suggest you gather them elsewhere. I have a cold pudding that needs setting." The interview was short, but it was enough to stir the waters. By the time Miss Marple made her own quiet call at Elm House that afternoon, the entire village had begun whispering Lydia's name in earnest. "She's always looked down her nose at people," muttered Mrs. Harper outside the post office. "Thinks being a Martingale gives her immunity." Miss Marple, of course, did not speculate aloud, but she listened. She always listened. When Lydia answered the door, she seemed unsurprised by the visit. "Come to join the chorus of suspicion. Miss Marple? Nothing so musical, I assure you," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I simply thought you might appreciate some company." Lydia arched a brow, but stepped aside. In the parlour, Miss Marple took in the room with a gentle eye. The stiff-backed chairs, the lace doilies, the faint scent of lemon polish. Everything was in its proper place. But Daphne was absent. "Niece has gone into town for the day," Lydia said, noting Miss Marple's glance. "Books to return, apparently, and a desire to be away from all this nonsense." "It has been rather unpleasant," Miss Marple agreed. "The loss of Miss Pratt, of course, but even more so, the haste with which people assign blame." Lydia's lips tightened. "It's always the same in villages. Someone must be guilty, and better if it's someone whose tone they never liked." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find guilt is rarely decided by tone, more often by behaviour. Reactions, little inconsistencies." Lydia looked at her sharply. "And what inconsistencies have you observed in me?" "Oh, none, dear, not yet." There was a pause. Then Lydia leaned forward, her voice lowered. "She threatened me, you know. Evangeline." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "With what?" "She claimed to know something about Daphne, something that would bring disgrace to the family. She said it was my fault for bringing her back here, that I'd be sorry." "And were you? I didn't take her seriously," Lydia said. "She was always melodramatic. But then she mentioned the rhyme tent, said she was working on a way to reveal everything through the contest, that it would be entertaining for the public." Miss Marple nodded. "That does sound like her. She had a theatrical streak." "She was cruel," Lydia said tightly. "She enjoyed watching people squirm, but I didn't kill her. That's not how I deal with problems." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently, "but someone did." After tea, Miss Marple made her way home by way of the green. A group of children played near the spot where the rhyme tent had stood, now flattened and forgotten. One of the boys was singing as he skipped over paving stones. "1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy." The rest trailed off, but the sound clung to Miss Marple as she passed. Back at her cottage, she recorded her thoughts as she always did. Lydia confirms Miss Pratt intended to use the rhyme tent to reveal a secret about Daphne. Motivation for murder, fear of public disgrace. Lydia composed under pressure, capable of silence, but not necessarily of violence. Then, after a pause, she added, "Where was Daphne at the time of the murder?" The next morning, the inquiry took an unexpected turn. "Polly, Ransom arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep, pale and wide-eyed, clutching a small velvet book. I found it," she said, "in the donation box at the church hall. I think someone meant to throw it out quietly." Miss Marple opened the book carefully. Inside were several pages of poetry in a woman's looping hand. But between the verses, tucked loosely in the spine, were torn fragments of correspondence, letters from someone in Cheltenham. The tone was informal, familiar, and troubling. Daphne, the letters revealed, had left Cheltenham under pressure. There had been whispers, an inappropriate relationship with a tutor, a threat of scandal, and finally a quiet departure to avoid further embarrassment to the family. Miss Marple closed the book gently. "Did you read them?" she asked Polly. "Only enough to see the name. You did well to bring them to me." That evening Miss Marple sat again by the fire, the notebook open before her. Motive is deepening. If Lydia feared exposure, she had reason to act. But what of Daphne? Had Miss Pratt turned her attention to the niece instead? Was the rhyme not meant to accuse Lydia, but to warn her? She turned to a fresh page. The rhyme card was torn before it was read. Deliberately, 7 for a secret, never to be told. She wrote the words out slowly, underlining them. Someone feared a secret would be revealed. Someone acted swiftly, decisively. But did the police have the right suspect? She doubted it. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were not those who shouted or schemed, but those who waited quietly until it was time to strike. And in St. Giles, someone was still waiting. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Sunday in St. Giles began with a pew full of restless minds. The congregation sat stiffer than usual, and the hymns were sung with more concentration than spirit. Reverend Prowse, though steady in his sermon, could not help but notice how few eyes lingered on the pulpit and how many darted toward Lydia Martingale's seat near the front. Lydia herself was unflinching. Her chin remained high, her gloves immaculate, and her expression unreadable. But Miss Marple, seated 3 rows behind, saw the way her hands tightened each time Daphne shifted beside her. If Lydia was a woman composed on the outside, her body betrayed that she was containing more than words. After the service, the usual bustle of parishioners filing out beneath the lich gate gave way to awkward gaps and cautious greetings. Even Mrs. Calthorpe, usually eager to comment on the sermon's length, said nothing at all. Miss Marple did not linger in the crowd. Instead, she slipped away toward the side path that led behind the church. Her destination, a quiet bench, shaded by a copper beech tree. A minute later, just as she had predicted, Daphne Martingale followed, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "You knew I'd come," Daphne said, sitting beside her. "I thought you might," Miss Marple replied gently. "Some burdens are lighter when spoken aloud." Daphne stared down at her clasped hands. "I didn't kill Miss Pratt." "I know, but I didn't stop it either," she whispered. "Not when I might have. I thought I could reason with her, but she wanted to make a spectacle of it." "She threatened to expose you?" "Not just me," Daphne said. "My father too. The incident in Cheltenham, it wasn't what people think. I wasn't involved with a tutor. It was about money, a loan taken by my father, using my name as guarantor. She found out, said it was dishonest, said the village deserved to know what kind of family I came from." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Only the rustling of leaves answered them. "She said she was going to make it rhyme," Daphne continued bitterly. "Turn my life into some clever couplet in front of everyone. That's what she did, you know. She didn't just punish people, she embarrassed them. She humiliated people with clever turns of phrase." Miss Marple's voice was soft. She believed the truth should never be hidden, but perhaps she forgot that some truths can be cruel when exposed without kindness. "I didn't tell my aunt. I should have. I thought if I could convince Miss Pratt to stop quietly, it would all go away." "But it didn't," said Miss Marple. "And now she's gone." Daphne nodded, her eyes glistening. "Aunt Lydia thinks I'm still just a child, but I know what silence costs." Miss Marple reached over and placed a gloved hand on the girls. "And now, so do I." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Elm House again, not with questions, but with a tin of shortbread and a quiet request to speak privately. Lydia received her coolly, but with that same brittleness of someone too tired to argue. "Daphne's troubled," Miss Marple began, "and I think you know why." Lydia closed the parlour door. "She hasn't told you everything? She's told me enough to understand that she was afraid, of shame, of your disappointment." Lydia sat down slowly, as though the conversation itself took weight from her limbs. "It wasn't the Cheltenham business that worried me. I could have weathered that. It was what Evangeline threatened next." Miss Marple listened. She said she had a letter from my late husband. Lydia's voice was taut. She claimed it proved that Reginald had been unfaithful, that he'd fathered a child years ago, and someone in the village knew. She said she was going to include it in the rhyme tent as part of a local history game. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "And did such a letter exist?" "I don't know," Lydia said. "She could have invented it to torment me, but she said it with such relish, as if she had already written the card. She told me, 'It'll be one for sorrow, Lydia. You won't like the joy that follows.'" Miss Marple sat very still. "Did you confront her again after that?" Lydia shook her head. "No, I avoided her. I thought if I left it alone, she'd move on to someone else. She always did." "She didn't. No. This time she meant to finish it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantel, where a small ceramic robin sat beside a photograph of Reginald Martingale in uniform. "Fear is a powerful thing," she said quietly, "but the need to protect someone we love, sometimes that's stronger still." Lydia looked up sharply. "You think I killed her?" "I think someone did, and I think they believed they were defending something precious. Their family, their dignity, their future." Lydia said nothing. Miss Marple rose to leave. "Secrets are heavy, Lydia, but they don't vanish just because we pretend they aren't there. Someone believed Evangeline Pratt had the power to destroy them, and someone made sure she wouldn't." That night, Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, notebook open before her. She added to her entries, Daphne's scandal, financial, not romantic, likely not motive for murder. Lydia's fear tied to possible letter implicating her late husband. Miss Pratt's rhyme threats tailored to personal humiliations. More than one target. She paused, then underlined her final note twice. Who had the most to lose from everyone being exposed? She closed the book and looked out into the quiet evening, the firelight flickering across her face. The killer hadn't acted out of hate, they had acted out of desperation. But desperation, Miss Marple knew, could be just as deadly. Chapter 7. Another twist. The Monday post arrived later than usual, thanks to a bicycle chain mishap on the part of young Alfred Tibbs, who delivered the mail with erratic enthusiasm. But when the bundle finally landed on Miss Marple's side table, something within it shifted the tide of the investigation. She had not expected anything urgent. A circular from the Women's Institute, perhaps. A catalogue for autumn seed bulbs. Instead, she found a pale cream envelope with no return address and a curious weight to it. Heavy paper, folded thickly. Inside was a single rhyme card, not handwritten, but typed, carefully, cleanly. 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold. But 7 for a secret too deadly to be told. The original line, of course, ended never to be told. This one had been deliberately altered. Miss Marple sat very still. She studied the card's font, standard typewriter lettering, nothing ornate. But the spacing between lines was slightly off. The final phrase had been retyped over a correction. Ginger held the paper up to the light and saw a faint imprint beneath the word deadly. There had been another word there first, something replaced, possibly shameful. She folded the paper gently and placed it on the table beside the original torn rhyme card. 2 different cards. One altered. This was not part of the official rhyme display. Someone had typed this card separately, recently. Someone was still playing the game. Later that afternoon, she paid a call to Mrs. Weatherby, ostensibly to return a borrowed cake tin, but in reality to follow a hunch. Mrs. Weatherby was a great collector of stories, mostly without intending to be. People spoke in her kitchen without realizing their words carried meaning, and Miss Marple found her one of the most reliable sources of unfiltered truth. "Oh, Jane," Mrs. Weatherby said, ushering her in with a flurry of apron strings, "you'll never guess. I heard something odd from young Alfred. He said he saw someone poking around the church hall yesterday evening, long after the place had closed." Miss Marple accepted a tea cake and waited. Said it was a girl. Thought it might be Daphne Martingale. But when he called out, she bolted, disappeared toward the green. Miss Marple's thoughts turned at once to the donation box, where Polly had found the velvet book. Had Daphne returned to retrieve something, or to plant something? After a polite visit, she returned home and reviewed the new card again. The change in wording stood out most of all. Too deadly to be told. A threat? A warning? Or a confession? The next day brought confirmation that someone else in the village was on edge. Polly Ransom arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just before lunch, looking pale. "I think someone's following me," she said. Miss Marple closed her book. "Tell me what happened." Polly sat down, wrapping her cardigan tight around herself. "I was walking home from the grocer's yesterday evening. I felt someone behind me, just footsteps, slow, matching mine. When I turned, there was no one. But it happened again. Near the old school gate, it felt like watching." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Was this before or after you brought me the velvet book?" "After." That confirmed it. Someone knew the book had resurfaced. Someone who didn't want Daphne's past or anyone else's secrets reopened. "Have you told anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. "No, only you. Then you must remain calm. And you must stay visible. Visible. The most dangerous secrets thrive in the dark," said Miss Marple. "We mustn't give them shelter." That evening, Miss Marple wrote quietly in her notebook. "New rhyme card delivered. Altered. Typed. Not part of original display. Appears posthumous. Intentional rephrasing. Deadly over shameful. Someone is escalating. Alfred Tibbs saw Daphne, or someone like her, at Church Hall after hours. Possibility. Retrieval of evidence, or planting of misleading clue." Polly followed. Suggests someone is nervous she knows too much, or that she's being watched, not for harm, but for silence. She tapped her pen against the page and then added, "The killer is not finished. They want control of the narrative. Still managing the story, even now." Outside, the leaves stirred restlessly in the wind. Miss Marple looked out at the village, so small, so quiet, and so completely tangled in its own fears. She could feel it, now, the edges of the truth. Someone was circling, not in fear, but in strategy. And soon she would make her move, not to accuse, but to watch, to test, and when the right person gave the wrong reaction, the final mask would slip. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Tuesday morning arrived with a hard frost. The lawns of St. Giles sparkled silver beneath the rising sun, and breath hung in soft clouds above steaming teacups. Despite the cold, there was movement on the Nature Green. The Women's Guild had planned a winter clothes donation drive, and true to tradition, they gathered outside the church hall with tables, bins, and tartan blankets for their displays. Miss Marple was there early, not because she intended to donate or sort, though she brought along 2 neatly folded jumpers, but because she needed to observe. The church hall had become something of a quiet epicenter in the wake of Miss Pratt's death, and today it would serve a different function, as a stage. She took her usual seat on the bench nearest the entrance, knitting bag beside her, eyes peering calmly over her glasses. Within the hour, most of the familiar faces had arrived. Mrs. Weatherby, bustling and warm. Polly Ransom, eyes still slightly nervous but holding firm. Daphne Martingale, helping sort scarves. And finally, Lydia Martingale, sweeping in with her usual chilly elegance, wrapped in a dark green coat with fur at the collar. Miss Marple waited. She had chosen today carefully. The atmosphere would be busy, yet casual. People would speak without, thinking, distracted by small tasks and warmth-seeking chatter. It was the perfect place to introduce just the right drop of disruption. At 11:30, she stood and made her way to the centre table. "Such a lovely turnout," she said lightly. "You know, it rather reminds me of the time in St. Mary." Mead when we had a similar collection, and someone discovered an envelope tucked into an old coat pocket. Caused quite a stir. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Weatherby, perking up. "Turned out to be a will, didn't it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed, and not the sort of will one would wish made public." She paused, letting the idea settle. "Funny thing," she went on, turning to no one in particular. "How people hide things in the folds of fabric. Letters, secrets, even rhyme cards." There was a stillness in the moment that followed. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. Miss Marple turned slightly, watching each face without staring. Polly looked up, wide-eyed. Daphne glanced down at the tablecloth. But it was Lydia Martingale who turned her head just a touch too sharply. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, her voice crisp. "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple said gently. "Only a passing thought. It came to mind yesterday when I received another rhyme card, typed this time, rather different from the ones Miss Pratt had prepared." Daphne stilled. "Another? It was curious, really. The final line had been changed. Not never to be told, but too deadly to be told." Polly's hand went to her mouth. Miss Marple added mildly, "One does wonder who might have typed it, especially since Miss Pratt was no longer alive to do so." There was a beat of silence. Lydia looked away, but her jaw had tightened visibly. Daphne's face had gone pale. Miss Marple turned to her, kindly but unflinching. "You wouldn't happen to know who still has access to a typewriter in the village, would you, my dear?" Daphne opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes flickered once toward her aunt. That was it, the smallest gesture. But it said enough, though Marple gave no indication she had seen it. Instead, she turned to Mrs. Weatherby. "Would you be a dear and fetch me a cup of tea? My fingers are beginning to freeze." As the group scattered slightly with the break in tension, Miss Marple returned to her bench. She sat quietly, knitting, her mind humming. The glance was what she'd expected. Daphne had not typed the card, but she knew who had. And that glance hadn't been to someone she feared. It had been to someone she protected. Inside her notebook, that evening, Miss Marple wrote, the card was not a threat. It was a cover. A message rewritten after the fact. Someone altered Miss Pratt's original card to change the meaning. Someone who wanted to suggest danger rather than shame. Someone afraid of scandal, not murder. She paused, then added, Lydia. Calm, precise, deliberate. A woman who would not act in anger, but would act to contain a threat. She tapped her pen, then turned the page and began writing in a slower, more measured hand. But what if Miss Pratt wasn't the only player? What if the true author of the rhyme cards, at least one of them, was someone else entirely? She flipped back through her previous notes, rereading Polly's recollection of Miss Pratt's classroom lessons. The way she used rhymes not to accuse, but to hint, to unsettle. And then it struck her. Miss Pratt may have held secrets, but she had not always understood them. She had been a vessel, a performer. The hand that wanted the story told might not have belonged to her. It was a different question now. Not who killed Miss Pratt out of fear, but who wanted the village to see the killing as something else. She drew one final line on the page. Someone manipulated the rhyme, after the fact, That's not just guilt, that's control. Outside, the frost had returned, and inside St. Giles, the killer believed they had buried the truth beneath words. But Miss Marple knew better. The rhyme wasn't finished, and the final line, if she played her hand carefully, was about to be spoken. Chapter 9. The reveal Wednesday morning in St. Giles broke with a clarity not seen in days. The air had a stillness to it, crisp and clear, as though the village itself was holding its breath. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple sent out 4 notes, each one brief, handwritten in her delicate script and delivered by young Alfred Tibbs, who looked pleased to be entrusted with something secret. The recipients were Polly Ransom, Lydia and Daphne Martingale, and Constable Evans. The notes all requested the same thing, that they attend a quiet meeting in the vicarage sitting room that afternoon. Reverend Prowse had agreed, albeit nervously. "I trust this isn't one of your more dramatic interventions, Miss Marple." She'd smiled. "Nothing dramatic, Reverend. Just a little clarity before the frost deepens." By 3:30 they had gathered. The vicar offered sherry and then wisely excused himself to the kitchen. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, hands folded over her notebook. Daphne sat beside her aunt, pale but composed. Polly stood near the window, fidgeting with her scarf. Constable Evans, who had rarely been in such polite company without his helmet, perched on the edge of the sofa, notebook in hand. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice warm but deliberate. "I know this past week has not been easy. The death of Miss Pratt shocked us all, even if she was not perhaps universally adored." There was a small, uncomfortable silence. Miss Marple continued. "As you know, the police investigation has not yet yielded a conclusive suspect. But I believe, based on some small observations and a certain rhyme, that the truth is now within our grasp." Evans cleared his throat. "If you've got something, Miss Marple, you'd best say it plain." "Oh, I shall," she said gently. "But plain things often benefit from a little context." She turned her eyes to Daphne. "Miss Martingale, I believe Miss Pratt threatened to expose you. Not about a scandal in Cheltenham, though that might have played into it, but about something you didn't even fully understand yourself. Something tied to your father." Daphne shifted uncomfortably. Lydia stiffened beside her. "She knew things," Daphne said quietly. "Things about my family, my father's debts, and something else, something vague about inheritance and false names. I didn't know what to make of it." Miss Marple nodded. Miss Pratt was never one to offer her knowledge cleanly. She preferred hints, rhymes, shadows. But someone understood the danger, someone who realized that if certain truths came to light, the cost wouldn't be embarrassment, it would be ruination. She turned now to Lydia. "You feared for your niece's reputation. But more than that, you feared for the Martingale name. You've carried that name with pride, with discipline. It mattered to you. Miss Pratt threatened it, and so you silenced her." Lydia's mouth opened, but no words emerged. "She died suddenly," Miss Marple continued, "without struggle, no wound. But you were near the tent that day, and you had access to her tea." There was a pause. "I didn't poison her," Lydia said at last. "That was never proven." "No, but you altered the rhyme card afterward. You tried to control the story, to make her death look like something more dramatic. A warning, a mystery within a mystery. You changed the last line, never to be told, to too deadly to be told. Polly gasped softly. You wanted the village to believe Miss Pratt had stumbled upon something dangerous, too dangerous for anyone to speak aloud. That way, you could bury the truth beneath ambiguity. Lydia's expression was unreadable, but she said nothing to contradict it. Miss Marple turned now to Polly. But there was one thing Lydia hadn't accounted for. You! Me? Polly blinked. You found Daphne's poetry book in the donation bin. Someone had hoped it would disappear quietly, but you gave it to me instead. That told the person responsible they no longer controlled the story. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the altered rhyme card. She handed it to Constable Evans. The ink is fresh. The typewriter used is a rare Remington model. Only 2 remain in the village. One sits in Lydia Martingale's study. Constable Evans flipped the card over, frowning. We'll have to confirm that. You'll find the ribbon inside was adjusted recently, and if you examine Miss Pratt's coat, you'll find faint traces of a bitter, root-based compound. Nothing obvious, but enough to suggest a delayed reaction. Lydia would have known where to find such a thing. She studied herbal medicine, did she not? I still have books on it, Lydia said quietly. Miss Marple's voice softened. Lydia, I believe you acted not out of hatred, but out of desperation. You saw a woman you couldn't control, threatening to shatter the last thing you held dear, your niece's future. But you made one mistake. Lydia's lips trembled. What mistake? You assumed Miss Pratt knew everything, but she didn't. She only suspected. She was planning to hint, not expose. If you had done nothing, she likely would have passed by with nothing more than an ominous rhyme and a raised eyebrow. Daphne covered her mouth. And now, Miss Marple said gently, a woman is dead. A niece is burdened by guilt. And you have let the Martingale name become forever linked not with scandal, but with silence and sorrow. There was a long, unbroken stillness. Then Lydia Martingale folded her gloved hands in her lap and nodded once. I will speak with the inspector, she said. I will tell them what I did. Daphne let out a breath, part grief, part relief. Constable Evans stood slowly. Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll take it from here. Miss Marple gave a small nod and turned to the window. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the hedges. The light had begun to soften, faint and fleeting, like the echo of a rhyme. Chapter 10. The aftermath a week had passed since Lydia Martingale's quiet confession to the authorities. No formal arrest had been made. Constable Evans, after a discreet discussion with Inspector Graves, had agreed to allow the matter to proceed with care. There would be an inquest. There might be charges. But for now, Lydia remained in Elm House, shuttered from view, her daily presence erased from the village lanes like footprints swept clean by wind. The village of St. Giles responded in the only way it knew how, with polite silence. There were no public condemnations, no outrage, no open pity. Just a coolness in the air when Lydia's name was mentioned, and a faint turning of heads when Daphne walked alone to the church. Miss Marple, for her part, made no comment to the curious few who tried to draw her into conversation. She declined invitations to share her thoughts over sherry, redirected gossip with questions about weather or preserves, and kept her counsel like a woman tending an heirloom rose. But she thought about it often, about Lydia, so precise, so composed, so wholly undone by the fear of disgrace, about Daphne, whose silence had nearly cost her more than reputation, and about the rhyme, the cruel elegance with which Evangeline Pratt had wielded language, unaware that her performance would provoke something irreversible. It was Polly Ransom, who came to visit on the Sunday after the dust had mostly settled. They sat in Miss Marple's drawing-room, the fire crackling and a tea-tray between them. Outside, the village green was touched with frost, the trees nearly bare. Winter was settling in, and with it the comforting rhythm of stillness. "I keep thinking about the card," Polly said quietly, cradling her teacup. "The way it was, changed. Too deadly to be told. It makes it sound like a warning. But it wasn't, was it? No, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "It was a disguise, a way to direct attention away from shame and toward fear. Lydia wanted us to think Miss Pratt had discovered something dangerous, but all she'd found was something humiliating. And sometimes that's enough." Polly hesitated. "Do you think it's over? I mean, is the truth all out now?" Miss Marple glanced at the firelight reflecting in her teacup. "Not all of it," she said. "There was no letter, you know." Polly looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "The letter that Miss Pratt claimed to have about Reginald Martingale's past. It never existed. Lydia searched for it after Miss Pratt died. She admitted that to me. She was hoping to find it and destroy it, but she never did." Polly's brow furrowed. "Then Miss Pratt lied?" "Not exactly. She implied. She hinted. She planted ideas without evidence. That was her way." Polly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So Lydia killed her for something that wasn't even real." Miss Marple looked over, her expression unreadable. "She killed her to stop a story from spreading. But stories don't need to be true to cause harm. They only need to be believed." The clock chimed gently. Polly set down her cup. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple," she said. "See through everything." "It isn't difficult," Miss Marple said mildly. "I've lived in villages long enough to know how people behave. It's never the great betrayals that cause the worst consequences. It's the small humiliations, the secrets we keep not because they're wicked, but because they are ordinary, and we cannot bear the thought of others knowing them." Later, after Polly had gone, Miss Marple tidied the tea-tray and returned to her notebook one last time. Jennifer opened to the final page and wrote, "Miss Pratt weaponized language. Lydia weaponized silence." The rhyme was never the truth, only the key to it. She paused, then added, "There is no such thing as an innocent rhyme, only listeners who fail to hear what it reveals." Outside, the village of St. Giles exhaled gently. Into winter, the donations from the church drive were packed and sent off. The last of the fair's decorations had been binned or burned. A new card was pinned to the notice board. "Carol rehearsals begin Thursday. All welcome." And Miss Marple, ever the observer, ever the gentle hand beneath the still waters, returned to her knitting as though nothing had happened. But behind her quiet eyes, every thread remained perfectly in place.